when you remain in one of these relationships or you remain in contact, you have to remind yourself. You almost have to hit yourself in the head and say, oh, that's right, this is toxic, especially on the good days, and how much the hope is like a narcotic that makes your judgment hazy. So let me start with this. Have you ever been in a narcissistic relationship or watched someone in a narcissistic relationship that all seem to hedge on the someday, right? Or on promises that are made or a future that's being suggested, not happening now, but down the road. And that this is a relationship that isn't all that great, but it's all about that someday. Things will be easier someday when we are married, or when we have a bigger house, or when we finish school, or we get another car, or I go into therapy, you go into therapy, we go into therapy. Someday, things are going to be better. Now, many relationships out there could be somewhat tweaked to a better direction if some things just switched up. More money, or an easier commute, or more childcare. That's true. But when the relationship itself is not healthy, lacks respect, lacks compassion, or lacks kindness, balance, support, empathy, no future event, no bag of money will ever make that relationship better. The future faked relationship is a type of narcissistic relationship that all hinges on that someday in the future after something happens. Now, there are two variations of the future faked relationship. The first is the version where the narcissistic person is chronically future faking the other person. Not an uncommon dynamic, right? But in this relationship, the narcissist is skillful at making exactly the right promise, and in fact, leaving you envisioning the someday better, that someday down the road. You can see the life that they're dangling. And yet, while they're dangling this life, they're still invalidating you, gaslighting you, manipulating you. All that stuff's happening too. But they're putting out there that future you want, or a life that looks like you want. When you are in a future faked relationship, your head is actually not in the game now. It's a game of someday, down the road. In a way, you aren't in a relationship with a person. You're in a relationship with a false promise, and the other person created that. When you raise issues about the future deliverables, the narcissist may say things like, I'm stressed now, but I won't be stressed down the road. Things will get better. That's a heck of a promise, and so you hold on. What the future faker in the future faked relationship is saying may also be plausible. You may be able to believe that the someday will turn up. For example, you may be students or you've just started a new job. So the younger that you are, the more likely the future faked relationship seems believable. But I have witnessed people into their 60s and 70s get into relationships that were largely future faked relationships as well. The foundation of the future faked relationship is the narrative of what is to come and how the change will come, but just not today. You just need to be patient. People in future faked relationships will find that they are often being asked to be patient, which can be really challenging when there is no backstop. You may have to make a bet with 3, 4, or 5, or even more years of your life to find it out. So the future faked relationship can feel like you're playing freeze tag, and you get frozen for a moment or for a lot longer than a moment while you wait for the time to pass, endure their ongoing bad behavior, hold out for that future faked outcome, and then the promised benchmarks never quite arrive. Then there is the second part of the future faked relationship. That is basically the self-gaslighted gambit that the person in the relationship plays with themselves. It's not that you fall for the future faking as much as you make bargains with yourself, such as you say to yourself, down the road, it'll get better, he will get the job, she will move out of her parents' house, and then things will get better. So for now, I'm not going to say anything because I'm just making too much of a fuss about something. I'm putting pressure on him or pressure on them. And it'll get better once that other thing changes. Now, it's not going to get better because you're dealing with someone narcissistic. It's going to stay the same. People in narcissistic relationships, and certainly definitely in future faked relationships, are often self-soothing themselves in terms of how they talk to themselves. This is going to get better. This is going to get easier. Everything's going to be fine. You're often trying to walk yourself through the mess that is this relationship by talking your way through it. And some of that means you keep saying it will get better, it will get better. You're sort of tragically future faking yourself, which is really a maintenance of the false hope that keeps so many people stuck in future faked relationships. The future faked relationship can be painful to witness. To watch a person saying, next time, next week, next year, it'll be better. Future faked relationships clearly have a strong trauma-bonded subtext to them, with people holding back on voicing their needs and justifying the relationship to themselves and everyone else and hoping that next time it will have a different ending. People sort of who are the observers of the future faked relationships will want to say, oh no, you did not. Really? Did you think it was going to be different this time? And sadly, over time, people stuck in future faked relationships may find that people are burning out on listening to them, making them subsequently more isolated. I think of future faked relationships as bad investments. You put lots of resources into them and wait, thinking that the yield will be good in the long term. The future faked narcissistic relationship is like buying real estate in a swampland or investing in a VCR company. It will not only not pay out, you are going to lose your money. But in this kind of a narcissistic relationship, the future faked relationship, where all of the hope is placed on something in the future and convincing yourself it will happen, or the narcissist convincing you it will happen, while the narcissistic person keeps buying time with those future promises, is the signature of the future faked relationship. Break out of this cycle by using the data from the past instead of selling yourself short or buying a fake story about the future. So when we talk about these different kinds of types of narcissistic relationships, this future faked relationship is really the one where the person is almost thinking, well, when we get to that point in the future, that's going to be the relationship I want to be in. Definitely the relationship a person's in now, not so good. But the idea that that relationship down the line is going to be great is exactly what the future faked relationship is. And it is, again, a subset of a narcissistic relationship where a person is enduring all of the usual narcissistic abuse, but are pinning it to a point in the future. Their happiness to a point in the future, I should say. So I hope that helps. You understand, those of you who are in future faked relationships, you might say, yep, if all those things that were being promised came through, this would be exactly the relationship I want. It's never going to be that relationship. Make your decisions accordingly. You know about those narcissistic relationships you can't break out of because they're just sort of structurally like marriage or work, and there's lots of rules and expectations around them. Those are the ones we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about this idea of the structural narcissistic relationship. Some narcissistic relationships last a lifetime because they are embedded into a structure. Marriage or long-term committed relationship with children, family, business, or community/social relationships. And these may be some of the most problematic and perhaps abusive narcissistic relationships of all, because the narcissistic person derives their power from the social capital you will lose or the shame you might incur if you try to leave the relationship or you actually leave the relationship. These structural relationships, the structural narcissistic relationships, they're the ones that are the most sticky. It can be about legal issues, custody, finances. That's what makes these ones hard to break out of, but also culture and stigma. And frankly, a person may just not be able to afford to quit working or get out of a business partnership without it costing a fortune or losing years of work. And don't underestimate the narcissistic people that lurk in social spaces like religious communities, neighborhood groups, local politics, even homeowner associations. That's honestly its own video. I have seen people go to the edge of narcissistic madness as part of homeowner organizations, like if you live in a condo or something. The narcissist is able to lie, cheat, and deceive without thinking or caring because they don't care. They've projected all of their shame onto you. So they are just fine with their bad behavior and they have no empathy. So these structural relationships actually work for them. They do what they want, and if they do not want the relationship to end, it often does not, because it really does take some real fortitude or even masochism to walk away from a long-term relationship or family or workplace. And it may even be, in some cases, be relatively perilous for people. The narcissistic people count on the captive audience that these structural relationships bring. Narcissists are not only very controlling, they're also very rejection sensitive, and they struggle with abandonment issues. So if they do finally leave a relationship, they almost always have their plan B already set up. So it doesn't feel so abandonment-y for them, right? They already have a new set up to receive them and give them validation and a place that they can regulate themselves. That whole plan B model, that is a narcissistic person's go-round game. So what does this do to survivors? These structural narcissistic relationships are tough because they bring up so many issues. Some folks desperately want out and can't see an easy out. They can't afford the divorce, or they feel that sense of stigma around things like family estrangement. The complicated part about families, especially large families, is that you may actually like a few people in your family system, and most people aren't willing to blow it all up. In addition, I still think estrangement in a family is still viewed through a lens of public judgment and shaming, especially if a person in conversation says they're estranged from some or all of their family. Although we are witnessing more acceptance of estrangement and why it happens, it still remains a societal taboo. And the person who is accepting or even wants the estrangement, often because of narcissistic abuse, is the one who is often viewed more suspiciously. So if you are the one who goes no contact, you are viewed as the problem, not the other way around. The thing that I loathe about these codified and structured narcissistic relationships like marriage is that they are often the ones that keep people the most stuck, the most shamed, the most trauma bonded, and the most enabled. So, what do you do? As I think more about healing for survivors, I recognize that people need the tools to heal even if they stay in the relationship. It's a tough balancing act because it means lots of radical acceptance, awareness of trauma-bonded patterns, setting massive boundaries with enablers, almost as massive as the boundaries that we need to set with the narcissistic folks, and breaking out of the hope cycles. When you remain in one of these relationships or you remain in contact, you have to remind yourself, you almost have to hit yourself in the head and say, oh, that's right, this is toxic, especially on the good days, and how much the hope is like a narcotic that makes your judgment hazy. It's not easy because just being exposed to the ongoing narcissistic abuse in these relationships means that you are constantly hearing and experiencing terrible stuff. But these structural relationships mean we have to constantly remain aware of not blaming ourselves. These structural relationships pull for a lot of justification. People don't want to go through the headache of a divorce or be single again or not disrupt their children's lives. So they justify the behavior until they are a shell of themselves. People don't like the idea of not having a family to turn to or to miss out on the sense of belonging or on family events. So they tell themselves that all families have issues. And trust me, not like this. Narcissistic family systems are special circles of hell. I've witnessed families with just issues, and I've witnessed narcissistic families. They're is a difference. People don't want to mess up long-term careers, mess up insurance benefits, or lose pensions or retirement funds, or obviously a salary, especially if you work in an industry that you've worked in for a long time, or worked a long time to succeed in, or had to get a lot of education to be in, or that is just hard to break into. People will frame and justify these settings and the toxic relationships themselves as just being, well, a difficult hazing ritual, or the nature of having a demanding boss. Community groups, religious groups, these are also tough, especially, for example, if you're a person of faith who likes being part of that kind of a community, and yet the structural part of the narcissism means you don't want to get out because you believe in something. This can all be really pronounced if you live in a small town or a more isolated area where these groups may be the only game in town, and without them, you stand the risk of becoming very lonely and isolated. People like belonging to something, even if it is a toxic relationship. And so these structural relationships can have some real staying power. I have witnessed people on the back end of dismantling these structural relationships. For example, horrible, expensive divorces, financial woes from workplace disruptions, and working within civil courts and painful distancing from families. And it is not easy. So these relationships represent a double bind of damned if you stay and damned if you leave. Many folks in these structural, codified, narcissistic relationships often opt to stay because it is easier than the anguish and the logistics, honestly, and the dismantling involved in leaving. I understand that. I really do. But if you do stay, that means you need to commit to not blaming yourself for another person's toxic behavior, radical acceptance, and recognizing that it's not going to change. These structural narcissistic relationships are tough, and for many folks who clear out a lot of other toxic people in their lives, these are the ones that often stick around and can really make healing difficult. Now we know this, not everyone can leave a narcissistic relationship. Money, children, culture, you know the drill, right? So people stay. Not everyone who is in one of these tolerator relationships actually understands narcissism. Sometimes the person doesn't have any clue with what narcissism is, but still creates a tolerator relationship. And I sometimes wonder if the people in this situation may not have ever learned what narcissism is, and if you're on this channel, you better. But they finally understood that nothing they do is making this relationship better. They can't or won't get out, so they just tolerate it. And that's what a tolerator relationship is. You just tolerate what's happening in this relationship. Some tolerator relationships are a throwback to generations past when divorce was very stigmatized, so people stuck it out in awful marriages with narcissistic folks. They would just tolerate the unempathic, invalidating, dismissive, manipulative, dreadful behavior and slowly sort of lose themselves. This sort of group of people who's had their life force sucked out of them by their narcissistic relationships in some ways can almost look like the women patients Freud worked with and wrote about, or even sort of the hollowed out housewives of the 1950s we know about. The tolerating in these relationships came out of not having any options. It may not have been a good thing, and these were often long-suffering folks in these relationships who just sort of over time learned to become numb, helpless, and almost dissociated from what the other person in the relationship was doing. I have witnessed it with folks I know and have worked with, and it is not pretty. Tolerating in a tolerator relationship is not what happens when you engage in radical acceptance, because tolerance, when you're in a tolerating relationship, there's a sort of passivity you have in these relationships. People who radically accept, that's not a passive process. It's an active process characterized by awareness that permeates you. It's an active disengagement. It's a concerted effort to break out of self-blame cycles by knowing that this person will never change, and then to embrace self-compassion, right? People within family systems have these sorts of tolerating relationships as well. Sometimes because they may not need to see the family members as often, so they may be able to tolerate for short sprints and then sort of live their lives away from the family member more often than not. But the longer and more extended the contact with the family members whom you think you have a tolerating relationship with, the more of a toll it takes. Now, sadly, in some ways, the tolerators need to be almost a little enably to stay in the relationship, because even as other people may be noticing that your relationship is terrible, or you even notice that you don't like how the narcissistic person is treating you, the person in a tolerator relationship may find themselves making excuses or just sort of anemically saying, what can I do? It's who they are. I get it, because the tolerators are in a terrible situation that they're trying to endure, and then they don't have an easy way out. Tolerating relationships can be observed not only in close relationships or marriages, but also in adult children of narcissists and family members and in colleagues. There is still so often so little recourse against toxic colleagues. So people may feel as though they just have to put up and may just spend their time drawing angry doodles during soul-sucking meetings. Maybe that's just me. And they tolerate because you recognize that given the limitations of the workplace, you sure as hell aren't going to be able to do much other than either quit the job or hope that the narcissistic person quits first. So you tolerate. I actually think that a really large proportion of narcissistic relationships are tolerating relationships. There isn't much to be done. They won't change. We can't always get out of them. And in some cases, there are lower impact narcissistic relationships we have in our lives where we just tolerate because the contact isn't often enough to make that big a change around it. But there can be such regret in the tolerating relationships. To be in a tolerating relationship can really bring up grief with the idea of, is this as good as it gets? Or is this all that life is? The only offset to being in a tolerating narcissistic relationship is to have other parts of your life that are more empathic and compassionate and loving and kind. Those spaces become places of rejuvenation. The tolerating narcissistic relationship in some ways is what we have become socialized to do. Put up and shut up. If you are in a tolerating narcissistic relationship, please get out there and find other spaces, callings, interests, anything to be an offset to this empty relational space. I know that one of the great challenges of narcissistic abuse is how many people are stuck. The tolerators can tolerate, but have to remember to not self-blame, to learn to disengage, to not enable, and find ways to bring some color and richness into their lives without the narcissist. I do sometimes wonder if most of us don't have at least one tolerator relationship, and the problem is these do take a toll on you. So just as a recap, the tolerator relationship is that relationship where you just sort of kind of put up with it. You don't try to change it. You don't really engage that much. You sometimes make excuses for it, but you just tolerate it. You certainly don't, I mean, again, in a way you might be thinking, what's the difference between this and radical acceptance? The tolerators are feel a bit more passive and helpless, as though this is my fate, this is my life. The radical acceptors are like, yeah, this isn't going to change, so I'm going to actually take some real action in my life in other places, recognizing that this person's never going to come around. In some ways, the tolerators, it's not that they're waiting for the narcissist to come around, but it's rather that the tolerator is almost like sort of I can only liken them to like a person marching like a soldier with their head down and just sort of trying to push themselves through the days and just enduring this thing that they're in, but not trying to make it better in any way. So that's what those tolerator relationships are. Like I said, I can't think of a person out there who has some narcissists in their life where this pattern doesn't characterize at least one of those relationships. This particular relationship we could call the euphorically recalled relationship. Some of you may be in this relationship, some of you know people who are, but you know this relationship. The folks who say, wow, we had such a good time on that vacation in Europe, or we built that business together and had all those late nights eating takeout and building our dream. Or our first date lasted 12 hours. Or we spent every morning making pancakes that spelled words. Or remember, we laid in bed until 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoons. And then you look up and you realize that the person is talking about things that happened 10 or 20 years ago. But the way they're talking about it, it's as though all of these fun, charming, comforting, passionate things happened recently. With the euphorically recalled relationships, all I can say is heaven bless these folks. I sometimes wonder if these relationships are the byproduct of the relationship coaching industry or the gratitude folks who tell people to just go and find all those sunshiny bits of your relationship and focus on those instead of the toxic, abusive, manipulated, gaslighted nightmare that your relationship has become. I actually think it's kind of a cruel thing to do to someone in a toxic relationship because it feels blamey. Then it's your fault for not seeing the good stuff, right? And the euphoric recall folks may just be Pollyannas who are stuck in a terrible situation. But when we look at this euphorically recalled relationship, there are a few things that are happening in this type of relationship. First, the euphorically recalled relationship may just be simple trauma-bonded justifications. We have such fun. We have such a nice life. 6 months ago, we had a good day, that kind of thing. And if there was some early good love bombing, then there are those memories to fall back on. The euphorically recalled relationship often has some good structural bones, meaning like maybe a nice house or a decent routine, that there are some bells and whistles around the relationship that can allow people to keep practicing denial and compartmentalization and keep talking about the good stuff. If you have been in a euphorically recalled relationship, you may remember that you would just want it to work, justify it. Maybe this euphoric recall pattern is a lifelong pattern. You were really good at justifying a narcissistic parent's behavior and were able to find a way to tell a story about how happy your childhood was. And so you would just ignore the bad, focus on the good, and keep crafting that narrative. Now, the second way that folks get to the euphorically recalled relationship is something I call the enough good days model. In fact, this euphorically recalled relationship style could actually be called the enough good days relationship. This is what we see too often, enough good days to keep a person in the relationship, enough bad days to question yourself. And folks in these euphoric recall relationships will focus on the enough good days to say, we took a nice walk this morning. We made dinner over the weekend. Nice things, but psychologically speaking, not enough to rationalize being emotionally abused and invalidated on a regular basis. Now, third is what I already hinted at, the existing rhetoric about relationships, to find the little things to be grateful for, to tell them something, to tell your narcissistic partner something you're grateful for every day, to journal about all the stuff you're grateful for in this relationship. It's all perfectly fine stuff to do in a healthy relationship. But in a narcissistic relationship, as far as I'm concerned, this is stuff that turns a person in one of these relationships almost into their own abuser, right? Forcing yourself to proclaim gratitude to someone who's doing so much harm, and then feeling silenced about talking about the toxic stuff because they're afraid of being raged at if they do point out that stuff. There are all kinds of folks out there who want to give out, again, that pithy advice of all relationships are difficult. The work is to just find those things you love about a person. Listen, if a relationship is healthy, you don't really have to work at this. The things to be grateful for are many and manifest. You may need to calibrate a little and not take a good person for granted. I think we are all at risk for doing that. But when I see the couples and the relationships out there that are healthy and that work, The gratitude just happens. It doesn't have to be performative. The euphorically recalled relationship may just be you trying to convince yourself that this relationship's okay. To say that you're having fun, and didn't we all have fun, and aren't we happy? Say that enough times, and you may just believe it. The trying to convince yourself gets risky because you start to lose yourself and deny parts of yourself to make it work. You keep recalling the early stuff, the good stuff, to keep the ship afloat. But as you do that, more and more holes are popping up in the hull of the ship, and you are taking on water. I sort of view the euphorically recalled narcissistic relationship as a person walking through the ruins of a crumbled down house they lived in and picking out the few good things that remain, a picture, a dish, a fork, a piece of clothing, and saying, see, there's still some good things here. It's heartbreaking to witness that, and it can really get people stuck in bad situations. The euphorically recalled narcissistic relationship can be confusing for the people around you because they're hearing from you that everything's good, you're happy, all's good in the relationship, it's all good, right? And that may mean when things really start getting toxic and fall apart, and they will, that you may actually feel that you don't have support or can't rally support because folks heard you talking about all the good stuff that happened. They may even see that the relationship doesn't look healthy, and yet you are pitching it as a treasure trove of good memories. So the people around you are confused, and people in the euphorically recalled relationships may actually feel embarrassed when they have to explain how bad things really were. In short, the euphorically recalled narcissistic relationship is a trauma-bonded manifestation, often made worse by the zeal of the world for everyone to be gratitude seekers and positivity mavens, even when a person is in a toxic mess. Folks in these relationships may feel blindsided because when everything falls apart, or the betrayals can't be unseen, there can still be a risk of looking backwards and wondering what happened. It takes folks who are in these relationships a minute to finally recognize that there is no fun dinner or vacation or house that can make up for invalidation, manipulation, and abuse. So the euphorically recalled relationship is in many ways sort of it's that surprise for many people who say they've been saying they're so happy and now they're not together anymore and they're really being open about what happened. There's a real danger because the danger of this relationship is as a person keeps pulling on these old memories they had of this relationship, talking about a trip 20 years ago as though it was yesterday. It keeps a person in proximity to a toxic situation that day in and day out is taking a toll on them. And I'm sorry, I don't buy this idea that if a person can sort of stoically keep their spine strong and stay in something, and think what happens more often, that is in the midst of that stoicism, that euphoric recall, everything's great. I got to tell you, these great things just happened, and they didn't just happen. There runs a real risk of a person falling into a place of physical and mental health issues from being exposed to such a toxic situation. If you were in this kind of relationship I'm about to talk about until you weren't, okay? So in this relationship, everything's fine. Everything's good. We're good. You would go to bed confused as hell, replaying conversations in your mind, but really you told yourself, oh, this is just marriage. This is just relationships. This is just how families are. Some days, every so often, you'd have one of those crises of confidence, but on most days, you would just soldier through and everything was fine. This is the denial-based narcissistic relationship. There are so many reasons for this denial-based kind of narcissistic relationship. One could be a person is surrounded by other narcissistic relationships. And obviously, if everything around you is a certain way, then it's almost impossible to discern that this kind of relationship is an issue. Or it could be that there's a person who's an enabler in one of these relationships and they just want to maintain the status quo. or a person who really literally doesn't know that narcissism is a thing, or a person who doesn't want to believe that narcissism is a thing. And I have encountered these people, and some of them are even people I know. And they've said things to me like, okay, Ramani, I get that this is what you do for a living, but this really isn't a thing, and you're just bitter about stuff that happened to you. Really? Needless to say, my boundaries have gone up with those people. But I am sure you know or have been this kind of person, right? It's a bit of a riff on the Pollyanna of it all. Like, this isn't a thing, right? Now, these kinds of denial-based relationships may exist for cultural reasons. And again, back to that idea of wanting to maintain the status quo of toxic relationships, and many other people in your family system or your community may be in these kinds of relationships. And again, the culture sort of supports them, so it becomes a sort of collective denial. Everybody's in it. Now, the denial-based narcissistic relationship actually accounts for a large proportion of narcissistic relationships. In fact, many people currently in these kinds of relationships, I don't think they'll be watching this video because, frankly, they don't think or may not want to think that anything is wrong in their relationship. But they may have their dark nights of the soul when they are confused as hell and may stumble into this very YouTube channel late at night as they try to make sense of it, and then the next day go back to denial. Now, one of the greatest challenges of relationships in general, and not just narcissistic relationships, is that many people love the idea of a relationship they are in, the idea of a family, and have a vision of what they wish it and hope or want it to be, and will break their hearts to try to make it look the way they want it to. They will organize everyone for that perfect holiday picture or the Mother's Day brunch or the family vacation, and it will be a sheer misery. Everyone complaining and gaslighting and manipulating, but that person who loves the idea of it all will fight to make it work until their heart breaks. They desperately want it to look the way they want a family to look. And so when the people within that family are treating them badly, they will just engage in denial, because at least the idea can stay afloat. Now, under those circumstances, acknowledgement of narcissism is messy. It means not just acknowledging that a partner is narcissistic, but also that they will never change. The holiday picture will always be a smiling semi-fiction. The holiday dinners are tolerated with seething contempt under the surface. The vacation is a sort of psychological lost weekend where everyone was miserable. Ultimately, the denial type relationship is about cognitive dissonance, trying to make the pieces fit, justifying and rationalizing and denying everything's fine, we're good, everything's great. A sort of fake Instagram narrative of family happiness, while this person in the relationship is actually shrinking into a shell of themselves because of the relationship. It's actually quite sad. The person in this relationship is trying so hard and are getting so hurt that they just start to get hollowed out. A few months ago, I talked with someone about a denial type relationship. Super sweet wife, very narcissistic husband. He's self-righteous and communal with some top notes of vulnerable narcissism sprinkled on top. 2 kids, adult kids, one narcissistic, one very anxious. The mother just wanted happy. She just wanted happy little vacations and happy family portraits and happy meals together. Not happy meals, happy meals. Like, let's be happy at the meal. You get it, right? She just wanted cuddle time on the couch with her husband and just to be a little bit cherished and desired and loved. She didn't need or want much beyond that. She just wanted them all to get along and to not be invalidated. It was not happening. It was impossible to get through to this woman because she was so entrenched in this denial distortion for a variety of reasons, but would have these troughs of sadness in her life when things would get so bad in these relationships, but she still couldn't or wouldn't understand the narcissism part. She would just cry about what was wrong in the relationship. So even when the dots were being connected by yours truly, nope, she couldn't hear it. She's a really nice person, so it was hard to watch, but she's in a denial relationship. As I said, there are lots of relationships like this. What ends up pushing them to the tipping point? Who knows? Sometimes it's infidelity, financial abuse. The narcissistic person themselves may leave one day. Maybe there's really bad public behavior. Someone else may be saying something to them. Children get older. In some cases, it's just a straw and a camel's back scenario. Being invisible just gets to be too much, something I'm hoping for with that really nice lady. I tread lightly on the denial relationships when I work with them clinically. If I push too hard, the client may go underground and say, I don't want to talk about this anymore. And then I'd lose the opportunity to at least be a support to them as they figure things out. But it can be really painful to witness these relationships, for example, if you're a friend. And the denial relationship people can actually be enablers themselves because they're trying to keep a leaky boat afloat themselves. You may find your patience being tested if this is your friend or someone close to you. Hearing the sad stories, witnessing the toxic relationship, and then your friend just sort of glossing it all over during a honeymoon period and saying, oh, it's all fine. And again, the cycle starts again. If you are in a denial relationship and got out, well done, because that was not easy. Because it really meant giving up on a lot of beliefs, and that is never an easy thing to do. If you are still in one and you are watching this, don't feel you have to address your relationship on someone else's schedule. You'll get there when the time is right. Recognizing it is a huge first step. Now, things I'd suggest include journaling, watching the patterns in the relationship, getting into therapy, preparing for grief, understanding your own relationship history before this, as well as understanding your family history, learning about cognitive dissonance, and above all else, recognize that this isn't your fault. Wanting to be happy is not a bad thing, but denial can be dangerous. Hope that explains that kind of relationship. And if any of you are in that kind of relationship or have been, drop it in the comments. Thanks again.